Hello YouTube and welcome to another episode of Raw History. Let's start with a quick question. How many witches were burnt at the stake in the Salem witch trials? Well, 0, because there's no such thing as witches. But how many people were burnt at the stake on the accusation of witchcraft during the Salem witch trials? The answer is still 0. Yeah, it's actually a total myth that witches were ever burnt at the stake in Salem. But wait, don't click away. I'm not going to ruin all your favourite witch-burning stereotypes. Over 185 people were still accused of witchcraft, and one guy was actually crushed to death by rocks, so... For just over a year, the colonial town of Salem in Massachusetts was seized by a mass hysteria starring LSD, a cake made out of human urine, and a total absence of any kind of logic or reason. So yeah, it's gonna be fun. We don't need no education. So the first thing that we need to know about the madness that was the Salem witch trials is that they weren't an isolated event. For hundreds of years throughout Europe, people had been persecuted and accused of witchcraft, and in Europe they were burnt at the stake. Over the years, thousands of people were hunted and murdered in what historians have come to know as the Great Witch Craze, which is actually one of the few examples of historians giving something a kick-ass name. I mean, the Great Witch Craze, that's something I want to know more about. However, Salem in America is by far the most famous of these events, and it's probably because of the fervour with which the townspeople pursued witches, and the ease with which they were led astray. However, I should point out that although we often talk about the Salem witch trials, and this video is in fact named after them, the early persecutions happened all around the Massachusetts Bay Area, and there were a lot of other small communities that also hunted witches. But most of the gnarly executions and the bull crap goings on did take place in Salem between February 1692 and May 1693, and so that's where we'll focus in this video because, let's be honest, that's where all the fun stuff is. And by fun stuff, I mean horrible stuff. So, to truly understand how a community could so enthusiastically collapse into chaos and dangerous levels of mistrust, we have to be aware of what was going on religiously at the time. So the people of Salem were somewhere between Puritans and Calvinists, and it's not really important to know the ins and outs of these two faiths, but it is important to know that these people were screwed up in their heads, and they were screwed up long before the witch trial started. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying all religious people are crazy psychopaths, I'm just saying that these religious people were crazy psychopaths. According to their beliefs, the people of Salem, and also the surrounding areas, lived with very strict rules about what was acceptable and what was not. Things like fancy clothes or using a metal crucifix were considered way too much bling for these people. And as well as hating everything fancy, the people of Salem hated everything else. All of those terrible things like dancing and singing and music were absolutely forbidden, and even Christmas and Easter were outlawed because they were considered too much fun. Children weren't allowed to have toys because play was thought to be a waste of time, and the only education that people got was 2 3-hour-long sermons every Wednesday and Sunday. You couldn't even sing hymns with a piano accompaniment in case you accidentally experienced anything other than complete misery. Compared to that, being hanged for witchcraft doesn't sound so bad anymore. No, I kid. But it is important for us to be aware that in the 1600s, everything that the people knew came from the Bible. They didn't just turn to it for moral guidance every so often, they believed every single word to be literally true, and in their defense, it does say in Exodus, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." I think, if nothing else, the events of Salem represent just how dangerous religious fundamentalism and a lack of education can be. So in 1689, just a few years before everything got completely out of control, a new minister came to Salem called Samuel Parris, and he brought with him his daughter Betty and his niece, a woman called Abigail Williams. If you know Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, or if you've seen the film, then these names might be familiar to you. And it was Abigail Williams, who is portrayed by the wonderful Winona Ryder, who first initiated the Salem witch trials when she accused her uncle's slave Tituba of performing witchcraft. It's not 100% clear why Abigail Williams did this. Some people say it was just pure racism, and other people say it's because Williams herself had something to hide, but either way it was the slave Tituba who was the first person to be accused of witchcraft, and it was from her that the entire madness erupted. So Tituba was arrested, and although she initially obviously denied being a witch, she was severely beaten and tortured by her master Samuel Parris, and in the end she finally confessed. Just a piece of friendly advice to any wannabe tyrants or dictators: never ever torture people to try and get the truth, because it won't ever work. But once the people of Salem had Tituba's torture-induced confession, they became terrified that Satan now lived amongst them, and in a very, very short period of time, the entire community just imploded in on itself. For just over a year, neighbours accused neighbours, and a whole community was torn apart by mistrust. Hundreds of people were rounded up and arrested, and 19 people were executed, and one other guy got crushed to death by rocks, which I will talk about in a few minutes, I promise. Now, there were any number of reasons that people could be accused of witchcraft, anything from physical disfigurements or moles or blemishes on the skin to poor church attendance, but there were also more sinister and arbitrary reasons that someone could be accused. Personal vendettas or avoiding debts or even just good old revenge became motivation enough for some people, and all someone had to do was say a bad thing about you in a public place, and all of a sudden you were fighting for your life. Fear and self-preservation also became really important. You had to accuse as many people as you could before any of them could accuse you. Now, there are an awful lot of historical myths about the Salem witch trials, including that all witches were women. Although women did just about make up a majority of those accused, it was probably more because they had fewer legal rights at the time and thus weren't able to defend themselves in courts as well as men. And there were a lot of men that were convicted. Of the 19 people that were hanged, 7 of them were men, and there were a lot more people that were imprisoned and arrested but never made it to trial. As I've said before, another myth is that witches in America were burnt at the stake, and although this is common in Europe, in Salem the preferred method of execution was hanging by the neck until dead. Although I promised you a guy being crushed to death by rocks, and on that, my friends, I can deliver. So, as I'm sure you can imagine, the law and due process realistically didn't count for very much at this time. But generally, a confession was needed before someone could be executed. However, getting this confession was not the easiest thing in the world to do, because the people of Salem believed that convicted witches, even if they were pardoned by the law, would still burn in hell. And so people would refuse to give a confession and face execution anyway, but in an attempt to save themselves from eternal damnation. There was one guy called Giles Corey who was arrested along with his wife Martha for witchcraft. However, Giles Corey seems to be a bit of a badass though, because he just straight up refused to plead either guilty or non-guilty. He just stayed silent throughout the entire procedure. According to the law at the time, if someone refused to plead, they couldn't be tried. And so this kind of stumped the people of Salem. They didn't know what to do. But as they always do in times like this, they turned to the simplest answer, which was torture. So poor old Giles Corey was taken out to a field and stripped naked and then tied down face up, and 6 men lifted a huge stone slab onto his chest and abdomen to try and get him to say something. But all Giles said when the prosecutors asked him to plead was more weight. And so for 2 days they added more and more stone slabs on top of him. Until, on September 19th, 1692, about noon at Salem, Giles Corey was pressed to death for standing mute. 3 days later, Martha Corey was hanged as a witch, and her body was thrown into a mass unconsecrated grave. Wow, that got intense. So just to briefly move away from the senseless and bafflingly stupid, you may be familiar with those perfectly watertight and irrefutable trials that were often used to test if someone was or wasn't a witch. And... what was that? They're not perfectly watertight. No! Have you ever heard the phrase, if she floats, she's a witch? In medieval Europe, there was a belief that witches were unbaptized, and so naturally if you threw them into water, The water would reject them and they would float. So if the woman sinks and drowns, then she was innocent. But if she floats or swims, then she must be a witch, and so she has to be executed. This is the absolute definition of a no-win situation. Now, there isn't actually any evidence to suggest that that test was ever used in Salem, but there were loads of other ludicrous trials that were used to ascertain someone's guilt in a court of law. A key figure here is this man, Cotton Mather. And he, probably more so than any other person, is responsible for the really dangerous mentalities that took hold in Salem. The most deadly influence that Mather had was convincing people that spectral evidence was enough to convict someone of being a witch. Spectral evidence is a form of evidence based on visions or instinct, and this means that if I just had a dream that someone was a witch, or if I just really thought they were, that was seen as concrete proof, and there was nothing they could do or say to defend themselves, and that person could probably be executed just because of my subconscious. However, by far my favourite method of testing for a witch involves using a witch cake. And this brings us back to good old Samuel Parris. So following the whole Tituba debacle, Samuel Parris ordered another one of his slaves to bake a cake, and the main ingredient was the urine of the girls who were thought to be afflicted by a witch. The cake was then fed to a dog, and the idea was that as the dog ate this disgusting concoction, the witch would feel the pain of being eaten, and so everyone would know who she was. Obviously this didn't work though, because, well, it's a cake made out of pee. Anyway, one question that's always baffled historians for years is why were there so many people in Salem that exhibited signs of being possessed? Like, it's true that more or less every single word that came out of Samuel Parris or Cotton Mather's mouth was absolute crap. But it's also true that there were a disproportionate number of people in Salem who suffered from convulsions or seizures, and it's not 100% clear why. However, new evidence suggests that maybe it was because the people of Salem ate a type of rye bread, and the grain of this rye bread was thought to have been infected with a natural chemical in the ground. A natural chemical that we use today to make LSD. That certainly would explain a lot. So, it's very easy for us to look back on the Salem witch trials and see them as a time of madness, but something that's completely removed from the 21st century and has no relevance to us today. But that's not entirely true. In Saudi Arabia, sorcery is still considered a capital offence, and every year up until 2014, people are publicly beheaded for witchcraft. In 2008 in Kenya, at least 11 people were burnt to death for supposedly being witches, and in Tanzania in 2007, at least 25 albino people were killed because they supposedly had magical powers. And in India, between 2003 and 2007, up to 750 people have been murdered due to nothing more than superstitious nonsense about witches. Perhaps in the Western world the witch trials are just history, but they represent a very dangerous ideology that is still present in every single country today. Fundamentalism of any religion, dogmatic ideologies, and a rejection of science can be found all over the world, and it leads to needless suffering in the form of sexism, racism, attacks on the disabled, and rampant homophobia. The Salem witch trials are a warning of what can happen to any society when its people completely reject reason. Okay, and on that dark note, I'm afraid I've run out of time, but please keep the discussion going in the comment section below this video, and don't forget to hit like and hit subscribe to make sure you don't miss any more future raw history videos. And my head scratcher for this week is, when cat food says new and improved flavour, how the hell do we know? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.